somebody else coined this, but mashing up the words advocate and bureaucrat, which I think is fine. If I talk about active transportation and somebody says you're advocating for biking and walking, well then talking about highways is advocating for driving. So like we're all just talking about modes of transportation and how everybody has all modes available to them that work for them. And I think that's the vision that I hold on to. I think especially of what it will be like when I age out of being able to drive. I can drive now, I don't much, but 20 to 25% of our state's population are non-drivers, and I'm sure Anna Zevart's talked about that in the previous Power Hour, and they need to go places. And so if more of us recognize that we will age into that population if we're not there already, then we're building the system for our future selves. We're kind of a short-term thinking species, so that's tough to hang on to. But I think saying this is a future state you can imagine yourself into is really important. I also think you need to give people something that's really relatable. And if you're somebody who drives everywhere, you think you drive everywhere. If you say, yeah, and once you park your car and get out of it, you want to be able to have a place to cross the street, right? The restaurant's on the other side, and you found parking on this side. You need crossings. That's a pedestrian facility, but you don't say pedestrian facility, say you person who drives need this thing. So I always want us to talk about the benefits for drivers of the kinds of changes we make that really also are primarily, we think, benefiting walking and biking. They really benefit everybody. And I will say one more thing. I think it's really important to have that bigger picture in mind so that you can accept that incremental progress is progress. If you set up as all or nothing and win or lose and you don't get it, then you lost. If you say, I made a step towards that future that I know I'm holding on to, I'm going the right direction, then you just won.
Thank you for that. First off, I guess I would like to anchor it within our policy. I think there's a lot of strong language in there about what we're trying to accomplish. And the essence of it is really to kind of view every transportation investment as an opportunity to foster vibrant, healthy, equitable, interconnected, accessible communities and a more sustainable and livable community. And the key to this to me is really rebalancing our system. And I think that's the challenge we're facing. Probably like a lot of communities, a lot of Sunbelt communities, we developed around the automobile. We developed in kind of a post-1950s world for the most part in the city of Tucson. And a lot of our network doesn't support active modes very effectively. I will say most of it has a lot of bike lanes, but for walking, it's a major challenge. And you really have to either, not have other options or really make a really a committed choice to kind of confronting the challenges of walking along a lot of our major, 40,000 ADT roadways to get to your most basic destinations. So for me, that vision is to rebalance the system so that everybody in this community has an opportunity to, take any mode to any destination in the city without fearing or feeling like they are kind of being abused by our public infrastructure. And it is rebalancing and it's understanding what those trade-offs are going to be. It is going to be a major change in thinking about what our priorities are in those investments and getting away from kind of that business of usual, whereas, level of service and delay determine what the investment is and everything else is treated as an add-on and kind of flipping that on its head.
Yeah, and I think you both kind of got to the point that our status quo, and I mean, anybody who's on this webinar is probably gonna be aware of the fact that baked into whether it be the models that we use or the assumptions that we have about how many or what purpose like a right-of-way serves is our societal assumptions about how people get around. And so, Patrick and Barb, if you could kind of go quickly into some detail about like, what are the first things in your site when you're saying like, in my position as an implementer, these are the things that we need to tackle in order to ensure that everybody is actually able to use these facilities. Like these are the first steps that will ensure that the default approach is a complete street where everybody who's walking, everybody who's rolling, everybody who's taking the bus or a train can feel safe, or can feel as comfortable and served on a street as drivers currently do. What are the steps that you think through in when you're thinking about how to achieve your vision? You know, what are some of the first things that you're like, okay, we need to knock this off, and then knock this off, and then knock this off?
I'll take a stab at it, and I'm glad Patrick mentioned performance metrics. And I don't know that it works well to preach at people about what they haven't been doing right. So I try to find what they have been doing and say, and now if you just extended it to these other modes, we've been really good at counting vehicles. We can count them because we built a complete network for them to move on. We didn't say, well, we need to see a certain number of cars before we build that bridge. Like, we built a bridge because you need to get somewhere. So I guess some of it might be, can you just draw some corollaries that make sense to people? And, you know, the counter on our floating bridge on State Route 520, world's longest floating bridge, is also the world's longest floating bike ped path. And it got over 1 million rapidly. And there weren't 1 million people walking or biking there before because there was no bridge that could carry them. And so where there are performance metrics you can tag onto, I guess they will mostly be missing anything about people walking or biking. We only count wait time for vehicle drivers at stoplights. We don't count wait time for pedestrians who don't have a walk signal at all. So I think there's some challenges there. I will say I think some of the wonkiest and most important work we can do is things like updating our design manual and just embedding it in the everyday practice. Every engineer in my agency reads the design manual. And we had quite an extensive update, and we'll have even more, triggered by the complete streets requirement that our legislature passed, but then also moving on to embed speed management practices and things as default settings. And that is, you have to justify not doing it instead of having to justify doing it. And so looking at where's that existing document that people already look at that just needs an update, It's not a small thing, but, and looking at the existing policy language that supports that. Our transportation state policy goals include safety. So how have we written safety into our manuals? Have we considered the safety outcome of every dollar we spend in design? And so there's a lot already there that people are used to turning to. I don't think it's making them look at something entirely new and different. I think it's using those existing tools and updating them as much as you can.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. So where we are with in the city of Tucson is, you know, we have established design guidelines that are consistent with the intent of our policy. And that was a major step for us in that we interpreted kind of that policy language and that more aspirational language that you're going to find in a document like that and put, you know, geometric dimensions on it of what it should look like on Tucson's roadway in our particular context. And that was a major step. But getting back to the point you made earlier is a lot of that is should language. And I think it's going to be critical now for us to translate that now into the shall language within a lot of our existing technical standards manual, because that's where a lot of our practitioners, our project delivery folks are going to be, you know, looking for that guidance or really the mandates that they are designing our roadways or transportation improvements under. Right now, it's kind of an either or approach. We strongly encourage internally and externally to, you know, default to the design guidelines, but it doesn't necessarily have as strong of teeth as the standards, although it is an option for practitioners. So translating that into something that has that shall language behind it, I think is absolutely critical. And really making sure that the practitioners or the engineering folks have buy-in on that and are participants in developing that. So it's not a feeling of it's an imposition, but rather something that's been developed in the next logical step in implementing this policy, which has come from the community, which has come from our political leadership, which has come from, you know, the entire community and kind of that the culture that is developing here around these concepts. Getting to a more specific in kind of playing with that performance measures, one of the challenges we have is about 70% of our travel in Tucson is occurring on our signalized network. I think that's unique for a city of this size, so it puts a lot of pressure on our traffic signals. And kind of our default is where we have 1 hour a day where we're dipping below level of service D, that's an intersection, increased in capacity. So we're adding, dual lefts, extra through lanes, additional right lanes, which became very difficult to navigate for people on bikes and pedestrians. So looking at what policy changes we can make just at our intersections, because again, that's where most of our crashes are occurring. That's where most of our kind of discontinuities for a lot of our transportation users are. Thinking about it in kind of that 24-hour perspective in terms of what is the load on this signal, and is it, or on this intersection, is it really worth that level investment to accommodate that 1 hour of traffic through this versus all the trade-offs that have to be made through that? So that's something we're looking at currently and seeing if we're okay, dipping below, say, level of service D for 1 hour a day, if it means that we don't have to, add those additional vehicular lanes. And while it's kind of wonky, I think it's going to be hugely important, because if it's something that all of staff and the practitioners and we can communicate clearly to the community what the trade-offs are, the policy justification, and why we're doing it, I think it's going to be extremely powerful. And people can say, okay, maybe there's comfort in saying we're okay knowing that there's going to be stacking at this intersection at certain times a day.
I had one more thought, and I think I saw Celeste Gilman on my team logged on, and Celeste is our point person on our Complete Streets implementation, because we did get a mandate and had to pivot very quickly to say, okay, what does that mean? That in a couple of months, it will be in the design of everything worth 500,000 or more, and that's most of our projects, or a lot of our projects. The internal communication to build a peer network of people who support each other and share examples has really been valuable there. And we have teams focused by topic and then region teams. So people don't have to feel alone in doing it, and they can share a small example or a big example and keep building this community of practice. And that might be tougher in a smaller agency where it's, you and your best friend working on it together or whatever it might be. And it's where I think national connections and regional connections and professional organizations are really important, just to have people to share examples and talk about the pain and agony, but also about the wins, and keeping that communication up. So as new people enter the agency, they are hearing, this is how we do things. And the more we can spread that among people who didn't get this training when they went to engineering school 40 years ago, we are training and retraining all along as well to support the policies.
I think that's a really good point, and I wanna expand on that and ask you both a question, because you both had kind of significant changes in the place that you work, as you both mentioned, due to policies that were passed by political actors. In Washington, you had the legislator's mandate that every project with a budget over $500,000 must include complete streets. Correct me if I'm interpreting that incorrectly, Barb. And Patrick, as you mentioned, in Tucson, you had your complete streets policy, which is why you, have a new design manual, and why you were brought in, as you said. And you've both talked about some of the ripple effects that come from that, and the different steps that you're taking. Can you go into a little more detail about, the most important things that were either explicitly created by these new policies or laws, or that were made easier by them, in terms of like the retraining of personnel, the creation of these networks, the ability to modify the existing documents, as you mentioned, Patrick, even the application for grants, whether they be at the federal level or at the state level. Like, what have the ripple effects been from these policy changes, and how have you been able to turn them into more momentum in your positions?
Barb?
Okay, if we're going to make me go first every time, I'll just go first every time. I will say we had laid a lot of groundwork as a division, so it wasn't sort of a deadlift from nothing to work with. We'd already had some updates to the design manual. We had our state active transportation plan, which I like to say is multiply award winning. And it gave a lot of detail to decision-making tools for the agency around what on our right-of-way would constitute acceptable standards, level of service in a different sense, what level of facilities service. And so we had those ready to go. We had those quantitative definitions. And if you shorthand it as wide, fast, busy, wide, fast, busy is tough for active transportation. And so that actually got written into the way that the Complete Streets mandate is designed. It says if speeds are 30 or above, if there's no separated facilities, you need to look at how you will apply Complete Streets principles and approaches. And so in essence, our active transportation plan standards got written into statute in the Complete Streets mandate. And so things that we would have been asking for then had that weight of a mandate. You will update the design manual to do the right things under the statute, just the way we update it to do anything else that's required by statute. So definitely that lent weight to that. We also had developed a speed management policy framework, and that is the next body of work that we'll be moving into both our design manual and our traffic manual, saying that's one of the tools. If we can't afford or don't have the roadway width for everything we would want in an ideal street, then we need to bring the speeds down so we have less speed differential between the modes, especially between bicyclists and drivers, and knowing that speed is what kills. And with bigger vehicles that we can't regulate, all we can do is deal with the roadway itself. So I would say it accelerated updates to the design manual. It broadened what we could do with that, made walk and bike facilities a baseline need. We used to have a form that said justify them. Now it says you're going to do them. What are you going to do? Which is a very different starting point. There is a reality check of funding that we can't do a project we're not funded for. And so the actual implementation on the ground requires the funding that we hope we end up getting more of to be able to do all the work we want to do. We also, I will say there's a spillover effect. My division gives out a variety of grants for active transportation facilities. And I would say we were already upholding general Complete Streets approaches, but now we're more explicit about that in saying if you're going to apply to us, we are putting out a local guide with design recommendations saying, if you want to get money from us, this is what we're looking for. We're looking for the preferred standard, not the minimum standard. We want you to think forward. That will not be enough sidewalk when more people are walking. That will not be enough bike lane or trail when more people are using that for transportation. And you add e-bikes into that mix. And we also have an e-bike grant program they gave us. So I think the demand is going to grow. It's induced demand. Let's use its power for good.
Yeah, so I think from our perspective, what we ended up doing was making sure that we had the investment priorities and kind of the design guidelines that, again, aligned with the intent of the policy passing. So in the context of when our policy passed, we were just kind of reaching the end of a 20-year regional transportation plan in which the priority was largely widening a lot of our arterial roadways. And that was a very I think at the time of passage, it wasn't so much, but in execution, it was very contentious, and people saw what that trade-off and what the impact was. It was accommodating, just one more lane in the urban core, and we had a $40 million capital project with $60 million in property acquisitions on top of it. It, totally changed kind of the frontage in a lot of those corridors. A lot of businesses were really relocated, residences were torn down. And it was a demonstration, I think, of what those priorities were. So at that time is when we passed the Complete Streets policy, and that really empowered us to begin looking not just at how we design projects, but actually what projects we are advancing. So we, on the heels of that, built on that momentum and developed the City of Tucson's first independent of the region long-range transportation plan, really identifying our own individual needs as kind of a mature, established jurisdiction within this region that has older kind of legacy infrastructure, and the priorities, we really changed them. Instead of saying, where do we need that capacity, is where do we have existing deficiencies that aren't meeting the needs of all users, and those became our priorities. So we used a safety kind of equity lens to determine where our next package of priority investments would be. So it wasn't even so much even putting a priority or much of a consideration on where those key bottlenecks are, or where we weren't accommodating vehicular traffic. And I think getting the community support and buy-in on that through that really kind of community driven or really outwardly facing process was really valuable in saying, look, these are the trade-offs. We understand that there will likely be, or we're not going to be accommodating or addressing congestion as our primary driver of transportation investments at this point. There are other priorities in the city. And we got the tailwinds of that, I think, by having the policy. So when we go back for these funding mechanisms, and there's a couple that A, we were recently successful on, and B, we're looking at a reauthorization of that regional funding source through the MPO. We're not putting road widenings in those projects. We're putting what we're calling kind of modernization or complete streets projects, and it's a safety first approach. And it's, what can we do to bring these up to our new standards that were established under the policy and the guidelines? I think we've also been successful in building on that and actually had a regional transportation tax that we passed last year that was primarily, again, focused on kind of updating and modernizing our system without adding capacity to our roadways. So it is safety focused. It's about 80% for kind of pavement maintenance, which we know that we have to maintain, and we hear a lot from the community, but we were successful in getting 20% of that for transportation safety investments, and we're using that as a mechanism to look at layering those funds onto our pavement work to kind of deliver more total projects. So instead of treating them independent of each other and say we're going to repave over here and we're going to install 50 feet of sidewalk over here, we're saying, well, we're repaving, let's look at this opportunity to bring that other funding source in. So if we need to, we can kind of upgrade this entire corridor and deliver a more complete project and package. And I think that's been very successful and largely supported by the community. And just being able to have that policy foundation and the political leadership behind you saying, there is comfort in spending transportation resources in this way, even though your commute's not necessarily going to get shorter as a result of these investments, but being able to communicate why we're doing that. And largely, I think the community is with us. It's not major concerns about that. One specific case I can give to is we actually have one project that we are moving from that 2006 plan, which was originally intended as another roadway widening. It's currently a 5-lane urban arterial. On the books, is going to a 6-lane divided. It's currently 90 feet of kind of public right-of-way. We would need 120 to 130 for that project. So again, it would have a major impact kind of in the core of the city. We use that foundation of the complete streets policy, of recognizing that we have a higher threshold for comfort for kind of delay at peak hours, to push back against that proposal and actually get a change of policy and change the scope of that project to, again, something that more aligns with our current goals, which is keeping the same throughput, but upgrading all elements of the roadway for safety. Because not only was the plan to widen the roadway, it's also one of our highest kind of pedestrian crash corridors in the city of Tucson. So we really made that case that this needs to be a safety first project. So I think that's going to be a model project for us, and we're just getting started on it right now.
I would like to pick up on what Patrick said about safety. I think we shouldn't see safety policy and complete streets policy as separate. And everybody who pays attention to this knows the numbers and knows the trends, and no state is alone if your numbers are going up. We've had 2021 was our highest pedestrian fatality rate numbers in 30 years. And we talk about them as numbers, but they are people, and they were, there are holes left when those people are gone. They're gone every day that they're gone. And that touches a lot of lives in a different way than something that can feel more abstract. And so if we look at what is our safety policy, and is that another thing that really needs to be updated as a foundation for that, that can be another opportunity to say, let's get the words in place that give us the authority and the grounding. We have an updated executive order saying that we are following the safe system approach, and safe roads and safe speeds are 2 of the 5 tools there. That's complete streets. Our high crash locations are not complete streets, ever. If you went and looked at the roadway profile, you say, yeah, that one's not complete. It's where we don't have places for people to walk. And we also, in our state, we have an environmental justice law that has us examining places with greater environmental health disparities and directing investments there. And those are also places that have incomplete streets. They were redlined. They're heavily impacted by high car traffic and emissions that go with that. And even if those were all EVs, we'd still have the brake and tire lining particles and every other pollutant. So, and they're heavier when they hit you. So, so there are many safety reasons to approach complete streets. And I would say if that's what resonates in your community, that's the message. It doesn't matter which label you use, it's the outcome that you are working for.
I think that's a really good point. And I wanted to kind of dive a little deeper into something that both of y'all have said explicitly and implicitly throughout this call, just something that we see in like federal transportation policy too, which is that complete streets and safety more broadly kind of get treated as a separate bucket of projects at the very least from our broader transportation system, right? Like it's transportation and then it's transportation safety, as opposed to what that new law in Washington state kind of mandates, where it's like, no, so long as you're doing a project, you have to consider the safety of all road users and prioritize that. So one thing that I wanted to ask the two of you, as people who are implementing all of the things that you've mentioned, like design manuals, peer learning, you know, changing projects like you mentioned, Patrick, which is really like, I'm so excited to hear that that's happening somewhere, project scopes getting changed post-hands. I'm wondering how you distinguish between between changes that will keep kind of complete streets and safety not necessarily marginalized, but in their own bucket, like as a separate add-on consideration, versus changes that will make them central to any transportation decisions, things that how to avoid keeping them in their own box, so to speak, or in their own separate funding stream, or in their own separate manual, things like this. Yeah. And Patrick, why don't you go first to change this up?
I thought we had established a rhythm here. I was ready to defer. Yeah, great question. And I think a couple of things that we've made an effort to do is terminology, honestly. And this is a challenge we've had and probably haven't been consistent in it. But trying not to call certain projects only complete streets projects and other projects, you know, transportation improvements or something. Understanding that all of the projects under our design manual are going to have complete streets elements. I mean, that's just kind of how we design our transportation improvements now. So instead of saying that thing that we just did is a, you know, whatever, blank avenue complete streets project, and that thing over there is just, yeah, we're just, you know, modernizing the roadway or upgrading the roadway or what have you. So I think that terminology really does matter, because people are like, what is a complete street? Point to me as a complete streets, and really emphasizing that it's something we're integrating into all of our transportation improvements, and that's reflected in our long range planning efforts. And we want to make sure that it is kind of that philosophy of making sure that we are accommodating and really prioritizing the most vulnerable users on the roadway, as opposed to treating them as an afterthought in our kind of design processes and procedures, if that makes sense. But yeah, I think really getting away from that terminology really is important, and having those definitions, because it's becomes that ultimately sets it up as an either or kind of dynamic between the two concepts, and that's what we're trying to avoid. So even in naming our manual that grew out of the complete streets policy, is we were intentional in not calling, you know, the complete streets design guidelines, because it would only apply to a subset of projects. We called it our Tucson street design guidelines. It applies to all streets.
Yeah, and ours, we are updating the design manual. It is the authoritative standard for the state. And I think the evolution for a state DOT, state DOTs are very different, by the way. what they are responsible for is different state by state. I found out some of them own all the roadways. Wow, we don't do that. And they're budgeted differently. So our legislature will provide a certain number of line item capital directives. You will build this thing. So it's not like there's a lot of discretionary funding. It's how much do we have to spend on the things we've been directed to spend it on. And so that's where for us, Complete Streets has really become integral to our preservation projects, because those are the primary opportunity in front of us. Most of the improvement projects, we would have already said, we are a multimodal agency. What are we doing here? If we're building something that is interrupting the active transportation networks, how could we complete them in a different way? And so building a trail alongside a highway project, for example. So I dropped a link in. There's a roadway reallocation guide that NCHRP put out, and Celeste Gilman on my team chaired that committee. It says you can work within the existing right-of-way and reallocate it. And I like the term road buffet rather than road diet. I got road buffet from somebody in California. Who doesn't love a buffet? Something for everybody, not just iceberg lettuce. And looking at what you can do with that, and you can, to me, I think that is space efficient transportation. You can move a lot more people on bikes in a bike lane than people in individual boxes or in a transit lane. And if you are looking at people throughput as your performance metrics, you can improve that. And as it can also be cost efficient in looking at that. You're not acquiring, oh my gosh, Patrick, all that right-of-way acquisition. Wow. And so I think it is not carving it out and calling it something different. We reviewed all of the projects that were going into design because our directive applied to all our projects. Now, some of them, you don't add a sidewalk on a completely access controlled separated stretch of I-5 through Seattle. That's not a thing. And so there are projects where it doesn't apply. There are other networks in place to use underneath the freeway. So you just make it, you just make it integral. You make it the way that things are done, and having to justify exceptions the other way around, I think, is really key.
Yeah, thank you both for that. And while I go through to see how many questions we've gotten from the audience, and if you're in the audience and have a question, feel free to put that in the Q&A section or throw that in the chat. One of the things that has been implicit throughout this call, there have been many things implicit and explicitly stated by the two of you throughout this call, is the fact that kind of personnel is policy in some ways. Barb, you've mentioned Celeste, and Patrick, obviously, you know, you got hired to implement this policy. And one of the things that we say internally at SGA is that culture eats policy for breakfast. So, you know, with all of that said, as public employees, you each have somewhat limited discretion in how you implement policy. You know, Celeste, you talked about the projects that y'all are required to build by the state legislature. So I was wondering how both of you work individually to use the discretion that you have to make the most progress possible. And do you see any way for employees like yourselves in both the public and private sector to work collectively to make sure that your workplace culture isn't eating good policy for breakfast, but, you know, improving it with good implementation so that people see a Complete Streets project and think, oh yeah, that's how I want all of the facilities near me to look, as opposed to thinking, wow, like this, I don't feel as safe on this because the design is weird or something along those lines. And I'm happy to chop up bits of that question because I know it was a lot of wording for me.
Yeah, I can take this one. So I think something Barb said earlier really resonated with me, and that's kind of that challenge between being kind of constrained within our positions, but also being internal advocates and kind of owning that reputation within the department. But you have to do it strategically. You have to be careful with it because it can be very off-putting for people. You know, if you feel like, if they feel like, oh, you are a new hire, you've come in under this new policy, and now you ultimately think that you have the right answer to every question, and it's an imposition, I don't think you're going to get a lot of traction and make a lot of progress with that. So I think it is really critical to build personal relationships and position yourself, not advocating your perspective necessarily, but really kind of being the champion or advocating for the policy and the intent that your jurisdiction or your agency has established. So it's just almost just kind of, hey, we have these new manuals, we have this policy, this is our directive now, and we want to make sure that we are incorporating this into all of our projects, and this is what that looks like. This isn't me telling you how to do your job, it's just more kind of continuing to sunlight that we have this these materials, and this is really what we've heard from our community and from our council. I think having that support from the top is absolutely critical, because if otherwise you're just fighting those internal battles and you're having those cultural clashes. Where you can have that policy in place and your council's behind it, and they have hired the executive positions at the departments that are there to implement those policies, it makes staff job easier up and down the line and really puts us into alignment on our mission, I think. That said, there are still a lot of discretionary decisions that can be made on project to project basis, and that's where that dialogue occurs, where we can implement, you know, maybe not everything that in all cases in the design guide, because it's not appropriate in all contexts, but there are elements that we will look to build in, and that kind of becomes that position in that discussion.
Yeah, I appreciate that point. I would say I think of my team as diplomats, not soldiers. Maybe this is because I grew up in a big family and I am not the oldest. That, you know, asking people where their pain points are and how is there something we can do to help those, because we now have this policy we do have to carry out. Is there something in this update or this evolution of existing processes that they are expert in, that they know how to use, that you want to use that expertise to move forward an agenda that's inclusive of things they've been wanting to do? I will say the experience in our agency where there were plenty of people who'd been wanting to do this work and had been getting told, no, that one's, we're going to have to leave it off this time because of budget or whatever. Now we don't leave it off. And so they are empowered by this. They're not resistant. There's a little bit of, do you really mean it? I think, like, after all these years, at last, I'm unleashed within scope, schedule, and budget. But those existing processes and experts are there to respect and to learn from and to work with. And I think instead of trying to go around them and seeing them as obstacles because they haven't been doing this all along, they weren't empowered to do it all along. And so I think that goes a long way. I would also say, oh, my audio may have just cut out because my phone is ringing. We talk about culture, but underneath culture is socialization. So how were we individually socialized? What did we grow up believing about transportation and people and whatever it might be? I grew up out in the country, and you drove to get groceries because there's no way you were going to bike to get groceries. It was miles and miles. And so I didn't ride a city bus till I was out of college, I think. So what is it that everybody grew up with? And can you dig into those and have them experience things a little differently? Our transportation operations team, under the TSMO work, Transportation Systems Management and Operations, did these mobility tours, and we worked with Disability Rights Washington. So in different parts of the state, we took a team of our staff out on a tour that was designed to show them multimodal transportation, and it was the good, the bad, and the ugly. And when you are crossing a 5-lane state highway with a blind pedestrian and a flashing beacon that stops flashing when you're only halfway across the road because she's not moving as fast as we are, that is a wake-up moment. What can be done to adjust that signal timing? And so that on-the-ground learning, I think, is another really great tool. Nobody should be allowed to design a project that they have only driven. Like, that should not even be a thing. Have you walked that? Have you biked that? Have you tried to get to a transit stop on that? States will have just completed and should have posted online a vulnerable road user safety assessment that was required under the IIJA. And I know our findings show the majority of the serious and fatal crashes on state routes are within proximity to schools and transit stops. And who doesn't care about kids getting to school safely? I think some of those are the things that individuals can relate to as people and as professionals, and that you can tell those stories internally to bring that culture and behavior along as well.
That's awesome. Thank you both for those points. And we have a couple questions. I think one of them that somebody sent to us in the chat, we ended up answering with that question, or with those answers there. I think one of the other questions that I wanted to ask, though, is about best practice recommendations for advisory committees or ways to provide advocates and residents clear avenues for influence and for providing feedback. I mean, Barb, you called yourself an advocrat. And I think one of the important ways, both for advocates or one of the important things for both advocates and advocates, is to make sure that their effort is being channeled into activities that are actually going to make a difference, as opposed to ending up on a shelf somewhere. So both within agencies and from outside of agencies, do either of you have either examples or like guiding principles about setting up avenues for influence? And Barb, I'll switch it up.
Can you say the last part of that again? Yeah.
Yeah. So
I didn't quite catch that.
yeah. So I think do either of you have either examples of structures that you like for people outside of like your agency to provide influence, or guiding principles when you're setting up those processes, so that people can contribute to your planning, to individual projects in a substantive and fruitful way, as opposed to I know a lot of times, like, I'll fill out a survey for something like a regional rail operator in my area, and they'll be like, what do you want? And I will hit caps lock and say, please run more trains. And I have no clue where that goes, so do you have any examples or best practices for providing for residents, advocates, or internally advocates ways to influence these decisions?
Well, it does matter that you commented on the rail plan, although you don't have to shout at them in all caps. The same words either way. I repeatedly tell local advocates, be in the plan, be in all the plans. Because from a state DOT perspective, we would not, for example, give a grant to something that wasn't in a local or regional plan, because somebody's got to be responsible for that trail after we fund it. And we don't build it, they build it, they own it, they maintain it. And so showing up and engaging with those planning processes every time really does matter. And I would say, I think there might be planning processes that are less commonly thought of for things like active transportation and complete streets. What's going on for if your health district is doing something about healthy eating, active living in your community, or active community environments? What does your school board decide about where to site the schools they build, and whether or not those are in walkable, bikeable locations, or are they on the cheapest possible land? And every kid's going to have to be bused. Those are significant decisions, those siting decisions. And if you ignored transportation completely and focused on land use, you would be doing transportation work. Because whether or not things are close enough together to walk and bike to is a land use decision that transportation agencies don't make. So I think that I also would say, if you have specific ideas you plan to run in a political sense as an ordinance or a bill at the state level or whatever it might be, it's not against the law for you to talk to state agency employees. It's not against the law for you to say, hey, if this were to happen, could you actually do this thing that we're describing here? I can answer that question. That's a factual question. I can say, wow, if you told me to implement that as of July 1, that's going to be really hard. If you gave us a year to spin up and some staff, it would run more smoothly. I'm not advocating for a budget. I'm just telling you the reality on the ground. And so And I will spot the may, should, shall, and I'll tell you what it means. And so it's okay to talk to us. I think that's, if there's not a wall, there's a phone. Please don't everybody on this email me all at once now. But I've been sick. I'm already behind. But seriously, I think if there were more of that kind of informal engagement outside the planning process and you had a relationship, then you would be better informed coming into that commenting, which always matters. Always do that.
Great points. I would like to, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that actually our complete streets policy came from outside of the city. It came from outside of our organization, and it was a well-organized, really effective community kind of grassroots organization called Living Streets Alliance, which operates here in the city of Tucson, that did the groundwork, put that document together, and then engaged with city leadership to make sure that it was approved and then applied. So, I mean, I think that's a case example of kind of that effort coming from outside of the advocacy organizations, and they've built those relationships. They know how to kind of navigate the city bureaucracy, and they know they have relationships with the political leadership of the city, and have been very effective. And I think changing the conversation here in the community, and one of the kind of the first things that got us moving in this direction with kind of the complete streets approach was having a really functional, really effective outside advocacy organization working in this space. For people who are engaging at kind of the project level or even the planning level, I would say the earlier the better. Track the projects from the beginning. The most influence on what that project is going to look at is when it's in the concept stage, when it's the least threatening. You know, we tend to get the most engagement near the end when a lot of the decisions are baked in. It would be very expensive and kind of difficult to change direction on that. But if those comments are heard early, or kind of what are the priorities and the allocation of space on the corridor, what are the project goals, like that's really meaningful input. You may not see it as the one person who is filling out a survey or putting in a public comment, but I can certainly speak, you know, personally and professionally from within our department, is those carry a lot of weight. I mean, even if we're getting 30 to 40 comments on a project, we take those very seriously and let them kind of guide our design decisions. So when there's something that's meaningful, even if it's 4 years away, when we're starting that design process or that concept process, really get engaged in that. And that's where you can start to shape it and absolutely build relationships, reach out to the folks in the department. I mean, we try to be as responsive sometimes, you know, and we can help you navigate some of that if there are specific projects that you have on your radar that you want to advance. I mean, we have intake forms and we log every project request that comes in, and you know, sometimes it goes on a list, and unfortunately it's a big idea and it's a $50 million project. It's not going to move, but sometimes it's little stuff that we could very well take care of in a couple months. It just wasn't on our radar, and by having somebody bring that to our attention in the community, like that's extremely valuable, and to be able to deliver those is really rewarding as a professional, because it's something that comes to our attention, we can turn around and we can deliver low cost, and it makes a big impact on the people who are pushing for it.
That's really great to hear. And so good to know that, one, I don't need to hit caps lock in the future, and two, that my suggestion to run more trains might actually go somewhere at this early stage. And we have one more question in the Q&A, which I think we can type an answer to about PROAG, which top of everybody's mind right now. But in the meantime, I wanted to kind of wrap us up right now by talking about a couple of events that are taking place in the next couple of months. First and foremost, registration for Transportation Camp DC 2024 is now open. If you're attending the TRB annual meeting, if you live in the DC area, or if you just want to have a good time with your fellow advocates and implementers, we encourage you to come join us on Saturday, January 6th, 2024. There should be a link in the chat where you can register. We also encourage people to save the date for Smart Growth America's 2024 Equity Summit, Meeting the Moment. The dynamic two-day program will be held in person for the first time on March 27th and 28th at the iconic MLK Jr. Memorial Library, and we're excited to see as many of you there as can make it. In addition, on January 10th, our friends at NACTO are hosting a webinar for member cities and partner agencies about operationalizing equity. Anytime NACDO says anything, I listen. So if you work at a member city or partner agency, highly recommend that you attend that webinar. And more broadly, we encourage people to check out the series of events hosted by our friends at Families for Safe Streets, because the work of making our transportation system safer can be very difficult and taxing, especially for people who come to it due to the loss of a friend or a loved one. And our collective choir can only maintain our song if we make sure to take the time to rest and heal. And these events that Families for Safe Streets hosts provide a way to do so. In addition, early next year, we at SGA plan on announcing what's next for Power Hours. So if you have thoughts on this, please make sure to fill out our survey that has been put in the chat. And that Zoom events promises me will get sent out to all of you in an email afterwards, so that we can include your thoughts in our decision-making process. And finally, as you know, today is Giving Tuesday. SGA and the National Complete Streets Coalition work together to advocate for safer streets and hold our decision makers accountable so we can make our built environment more equitable and accessible for everyone. So we appreciate everyone who attended today's Complete Streets Power Hour, an event that wouldn't be possible without your generous support. So please consider giving a gift to SGA this November 28th. And on behalf of SGA and the National Complete Streets Coalition, I want to thank all of you in the audience for attending today. I want to thank Barb and Patrick for taking time out of their early mornings over there on the West Coast. And I hope that all of you have a great rest of your day, a great rest of your week, and a great end to the calendar year with a happy holidays ahead. Thank you so much all for coming today. It's Patrick. Thanks, Barb.
Thanks. It's great.